Okay, well, hopefully this is working. Like I said when I tweeted announcing this is a new platform for me. I'm using the Rumble Studio. So this is broadcasting on the Open Forum Philosophy channel on Rumble, as well as on YouTube, or at least it should be. Let's see. It looks like it is up on YouTube. YouTube chat is working. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, seems like all is well here. Now I have to test out the presentation feature to see if I can actually bring up the Jitsi call if anyone wants to call in and discuss. I have stuff, of course, that I can talk about. I've been thinking that it seems like there's been a decline in philosophical thinking in our circles over the last year, especially. Um, Keith Woods seems to have abandoned philosophy, which is okay. Looks good. The chat is saying, sweet. Keith Woods seems to have abandoned philosophy, which I understand. It doesn't have mass appeal, and Keith has been getting more political, has been wanting to influence things on X, which he's done successfully. Talk about current events, talk about kind of the financial system, and all of that matters too. But uh, I was just working on a lecture. I'm doing a series of lectures for Compatriot Academy, which is just starting up. This is an organization that's kind of all oriented around the CTMU, Chris Langan's theory of everything. And it's not exclusively CTMU content, it's centered on that, but they want to do a course on Platonism, so I'm doing that. And I just recorded a lecture on protreptic arguments. Of course, protreptics is a type of argument that is oriented at exhortation of the listener to a particular course of action, especially philosophy, the study of, you know, things generally, pursuit of knowledge, education. Um, and so there are various types of protreptic argument. One is that the things that seem to be good in themselves that people talk about in common life, like status or wealth or even physical beauty, like these things can also get you into trouble if you don't have the wisdom to use them well. Like an attractive woman won't necessarily benefit from her beauty unless she understands the dangers that are associated with it, unless she understands where and how to display that beauty. Political influence can be used for good or evil, depending on whether you know what you ought to do with that political influence. So, other seeming goods aren't really goods in themselves. Only wisdom allows you to know whether what you're trying to do in politics or anything else is actually beneficial. Of course, ethics is a branch of philosophy. One thing that's happened is more and more people, this has been a trend for several years, more and more people have kind of retreated into whatever denomination of Christianity they support. I'll go ahead and start up the Jitsi call. The link to that is in the description. But as people have become more kind of dogmatically religious, um, they've stopped keeping their minds open on those basic questions. I think it is important to remember, though, that generally the way that you get into religion, if you're not simply raised in it, is by questioning those basic aspects of the human condition. What is the fate of the soul after death? Is there a God? What is the nature of God? And when religion tells you it has the answers to these things, sometimes you're dissatisfied with that and you're no longer interested in hearing other thoughts. What that creates, though, is parallel epistemologies that have no means of actually making contact. So a Muslim and a Christian can talk together about politics, they can talk with each other about various things that don't pertain directly to metaphysics or theology. but they really can't find that deep alignment and get on the same page where it matters. Okay, so Soma is in the Jitsi call. Soma, I think you can hear me in the Jitsi call, but they should not be able to hear you yet. Let me change the microphone that I'm using in here. Yeah, so you can hear me, but the stream should not be able to. I'm talking simultaneously to the person in the Jitsi call. Just wait 1 second while I get this set up. We'll see if this works. So I'm going to do a screen share. Should be able to actually share the audio. So there's that. All right. So now this is being shared, and let's test to see if the audio actually did go up. So you can let us know in the live chat. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Soma. So now they're hearing you. Soma. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, it's loud and clear.
Great. Okay. So go ahead and introduce yourself. The audience should be able to hear you now.
So I come from like quite a mixed background. And I've been leaning towards orthodoxy the last few years.
So turns out they can't hear you. Wait, never mind. Now they can. We're getting contradicting reports here from the same person. But it seems like they can hear you. No echo. It's all good. Let me know if the relative levels are good and everything. But go ahead and carry on, Soma.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of mute the stream itself because this is a bit delayed. But yeah, so I've kind of been leaning into orthodoxy for the last 2 to 4 years or so, but I can't really make the leap. I haven't been able to make the leap, right? And at the same time, I've been interested in eschatology, in the Vedas, and constantly with like the doubt of like wherever I'm going, I don't really know, and I just don't have the assuredness that like the people online I see have. And yeah, so I've kind of come to the same position that you are in, just with a much less of the foundational concepts. So.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was just talking about. People who want to subscribe to dogmatic religion, it ends up kind of siloing them off on certain questions. And I'm not a universal fallibilist or a universal skeptic where I don't believe knowledge is possible or we can never be certain. But I think certainty it has to be grounded. So here's, I guess, my theory of certainty. Certainty has to be grounded in something that is phenomenologically accessible. And the problem with dogmatic assertions is that they're not necessarily phenomenologically accessible in a way that's indubitable because it's a statement made by someone else. It's like you can imagine the possible world pretty easily where a false authority has given teachings that you're supposed to take for granted, but it turns out that they're false. Like that's easily conceivable. Whereas if you're contemplating some mathematical truth, it's not conceivable how the alternative could be the case. Like, given all of the axioms you're working with, given the mathematical paradigm in question, if all of these things are true, then the result follows. And that's phenomenologically given. That kind of certainty is there. We can, like, describe it intersubjectively. And also, most importantly, it's there for you. So I think that's where certainty has to be grounded. And anything short of that results in this kind of siloing where now we can't like get to the bottom of this through dialogue. It's basically like saying, well, my position is simply right and I don't have to prove it to you. You have to accept the authority of this person or this institution. And I think our side generally, because we're more than just Orthodox or Catholic or Christians, even like people on our side of the internet looking for the world to move in the direction we want to have it move in, more traditionalist, or less immigration, things that many of us from many different communities want to happen. Like, we can't align and we can't accomplish what we want unless we can align on fundamental values, I think, because that those values determine strategy. And so that's what I've always believed in, open dialogue, which is why I host this show, by the way. But I'll go ahead and let you respond, Soma, and then we can bring. Oh, Tomer's here. I don't think I've seen Tomer's face before. That's funny. Good to see you, Tomer. But yeah, Soma, you go ahead, and then we'll bring the others in.
Yeah, so yeah, I kind of just see that you're right in this. We can't really progress if we don't have a shared foundational language, right, that we can use to kind of deal with the high level abstractions that will be necessary in order to achieve basically anything, any of our goals beyond a month, right? And dogma will have its place in it, but it has to serve a more useful kind of mode of operation or something.
Yeah, so the pragmatic argument for a philosophical over a dogmatic method, I think, is persuasive. With dogma, you end up just having incommensurable worldviews where you can't meet on any foundational or fundamental ground. It's just, I have this authority, you have that authority, and now we can't really talk to each other. And when you can't really talk to each other past a certain point, the only option becomes violence. And that's what dogmatic authorities have tended to do. When someone rejects the dogmatic authority that is in political power, they just get executed. And there's been many institutions like this that make dogmatic claims through history, and they've executed people who were factually correct in some cases. And it just doesn't seem like the way to arrive at the best strategy. And we need, like, we're in a revolutionary age as well, where, like, we need a correct worldview to navigate the transition to, like, the AI kind of future that we're encountering. We need a correct worldview to make sure that we survive when global systems are impacted by what we do. Not to kind of signal, as too green or eco-friendly. Like, that's my chief concern. But we can screw up the planet that we're living on if we don't have a correct worldview. And some Christians, some Orthodox or Catholics don't necessarily seem to care about the impact on the environment of certain practices, because it's not like, it doesn't necessarily follow from the dogmas of Catholicism or Orthodoxy. Muslims also don't seem always to care, because in their worldview, the earth will be destroyed. In Christians' worldview, like, there's going to be this kind of, Deus ex machina, literally, at the end of time, that's just going to fix everything. Whereas if we think we need to understand scientifically the nature of the world in order to perpetuate the species, well, then, regardless of whether Christ comes back, we'll be in a position to hopefully hang on. And maybe that's the form in which Christ does come back. Is that general knowledge, is that general kind of logos instantiated in human communities, or something like that? Like, I think we don't necessarily know what it will look like. I think there are elements of truth in these myths. Almost definitely, there have to be. And we can get into that discussion, but I don't want to monopolize it. I also want to make sure that everything's working appropriately still. So I'm going to stop for these reading the live chat as much, answering questions in the live chat. I want to prioritize callers who come in because they're willing to speak publicly, and that's a difficult thing sometimes. So I want to reward that. Also, I'm trying to build the community that I'm a part of, and all the people who are organizing the community. Of course, we have like 150 acres in Arkansas. There are more than a dozen people living here. We're trying to build alternatives for the real world, and we're doing that, and we're taking the risk of doing that when many other people recognize it is the thing to do, but they're not actually taking the risk to do it. So we're doing it, but the organizers here are not being compensated for it. Like, I'm president of this the PMA that we formed, but I'm not being paid. So, like, I need to find a way to make this profitable. Otherwise, I'll just have to go back to my normal job. and I won't be able to make the content. I do believe the content is worthwhile. Obviously, the people who are watching this believe it's worthwhile. So if you believe it's worthwhile, as evinced by the fact that you're here watching it, consider doing a super chat, asking a question, or just giving a comment. Also, if someone wouldn't mind, it would be nice if I could test to make sure that entropy is set up correctly. So I'm trying to, this is my first time trying to do super chats. So if somebody would, be generous enough, go ahead, and it can be a small amount. I'm just going to see if the super chat feature is working correctly. So please help me with that. The link is in the description for how to do that. One day I'll figure out how to get it on the screen. I'm doing this by myself. I've never done this setup before. Anyway, so I'll leave it at that. And now we'll go on. Tomer, since you're on camera, what do you have on your mind? What's going on with you? Okay, I can't hear you. Probably there's an issue with your mic. All right, so while you're getting that figured out, how about John, if you want to go ahead? Oh, and by the way, join in the Jitsi link, not the entropy link. I just had that up in case the Jitsi thing didn't work, the screen capture audio didn't work, but it seems like it is working. So how's it going, John?
I'm good, thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so this kind of, just going off the top of my head here, but the whole impossibility of a shared epistemology, getting a bit of feedback here now.
It seems like.
But yeah, okay. It's it's going back to the problem of the noumenal, I guess, that you never can go fully certainly into the mind of God, I guess. With that impossibility, isn't the best thing you can do a kind of Kierkegaard leap of faith thing, or is that not philosophical enough, a bit too romantic, maybe?
Well, there are many possible directions to leap, is the issue. I think faith has a role in the pursuit of truth. Like, you have to have faith that we have some contact with genuine reality in order to philosophize, in order to conduct science, or just engage in everyday discussion with others. Like, you have to have faith in what appears to us. You can have faith in God and the providence of God in order to justify that former kind of epistemic certainty, because like a good God would give us the faculties to discover the nature of reality, you might argue. So you can have faith in God's goodness and his desire to allow us access to wisdom, or you can have faith in some particular institution. And there are many competing institutions. There are different schools within even Orthodox Christianity. They disagree very often on fundamental things. Some purportedly Orthodox Christians seem to lean towards a doctrine more similar to divine simplicity. Some follow Gregory of Palamas and his, essence energy distinction as articulated in his particular version of orthodoxy. And so, like, the nature of those authorities are historically grounded and contingent, because our knowledge of history is contingent. And so, like, exactly what organization has that direct line of succession authority back to the early church, if that's where you ground your sense of authority, is like the church that Jesus started, well, that's not self-evident. And so the leap of faith is like, well, why? Well, the issue is there's no sufficient reason, no principle of sufficient reason why you're taking this leap of faith rather than that, if it's faith.
Well, I guess not to get all Heideggerian, but the situatedness, I think there's an authentic leap of faith available to everyone, more or less. Now, I really shouldn't speak on this because, of course, I have not followed in, let's say, the local dogmatic faith, and the institutions that would be kind of related to my Dasein, my situatedness, are obviously false. Well, as obvious as falsehood can be, I suppose, without any possibility of absolute epistemic certainty. But I guess what I want to say is just the leap of faith isn't entirely random if there's some kind of authenticity there.
Right, but we're all situated in different contexts, so the danger there is just cultural relativism. And like, well, I'm authentically situated in this tradition, so I should be this. Well, I'm authentically situated in that tradition. Well, then is truth relative? Because these different worldviews make contradictory truth claims, right?
Yeah, and I guess I'd be, I'll pass the mic over to someone else soon, but I guess I'd say, yeah, truth is relative. True, in the sense of true aim, for instance. I mean, it will be situated always. There is a greater truth. There is the one being as such, but whether that can be even, if we can even get close to that, I'm kind of skeptical. But yeah.
Well, okay, interesting. I would consider that to be a meta worldview. It is a kind of perennialism, perhaps, that you're talking about. And if that's true, well, then the claims of exclusive truth that Catholicism makes or that Islam makes are not true. So that then is exclusionary. And like, if you're right, we ought to be perennialists and we really can't be Catholics, even if we're culturally embedded in Catholicism, you know? Okay. So growing a mustache raised his hand in the Jitsi call.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I sent $3 over Entropy. I checked. It got deducted from my bank account. So
Okay. Thank you for testing that. I appreciate it.
well, no problem, Mr. Bombolo.
And now I'm trying to find it on Entropy. See, this is why I wanted to do this. I guess I had to turn on donations like once I went live. I don't know if I can see chats otherwise. Yeah, it seems like I hope you didn't just send it too soon and now I won't have access to it. I mean, there must be a way to see older chats, right? I don't mean for this to be a tech support stream though. What was what was the chat? Was there any question or comment?
I wrote mustache has been grown.
Okay, well that's good news. Can you show the mustache or
Uh,
that was the question?
it's a little bit. Just a second.
Oh yeah,
Here it is.
that's a mustache.
Full glory.
That counts definitely.
Yep.
I'm finally growing my beard back. Typically, I shave for the spring and summer. It's not quite fall, but I'm just going ahead with it now.
Yeah, I decided to grow my hair and beard out until I finish Plato's collected works. So it's gonna be fun.
Well, interesting. Are you using a particular collection, like the Cooper edition, or?
Yeah, I have the Cooper edition, and I have my father actually has a few separate works, some translated to English and some translated to Croatian. So I personally use the Cooper work, but I have more if I want.
Well, nice. Yeah, I like the Cooper edition. I would like to get the collected works all translated by Thomas Taylor. The more I've read Taylor translations, the more I've just gotten used to the old-timey language. He is, I agree with his general school of Neoplatonism. And so I think he's, bearing in mind the technical metaphysical terms much more than Benjamin Jowett or some of the other public domain author, translators of Plato. But some of the more recent ones, I do enjoy. Who are we using for Plotinus now? He's a professor at the University of Toronto. Let me see. University of Toronto, Plato, I'll search Plotinus, translator. I really recommend, oh yeah, Lloyd Gerson. And he has some books. I haven't read any of them yet. Karnik, who's been in most of these groups that we've done for Plato, he's reading one of Gerson's works. I'd like to read his Aristotle and Other Platonists book, which is just the idea that Aristotle wasn't as much in disagreement with Plato as many people think. And that's the position of late Neoplatonism. Simplicius, if you read his commentaries on Aristotle, he goes to great lengths to show the continuity and agreement between Plato and Aristotle in a convincing way, in a very rigorous, textually supported way. Like, for instance, people will say that Aristotle denied the existence of independent forms, that the form was always in the matter, hylomorphism, they're inseparable for Aristotle. But Simplicius argues that's not the case. In the 12th book of the Metaphysics, Aristotle talks about the forms themselves essentially as thoughts in the mind of the first mover, thought thinking itself. So the thought thinking itself contains, for Aristotle, kind of the paradigms of the things in the world. So Simplicius argues that Aristotle objected only to the convention of naming that Plato employed, where Plato took the names of mundane objects and called the forms after those names. So the form of beauty, the form of man, the form of horse. And for Aristotle, we should have like names, new names that don't confuse people to understand like the nature of those forms in themselves. Yeah, and then there's another passage in the On the Heavens where he talks about beyond the cosmos, there being entities that are outside of space and time that are always causally efficacious. And that Simplicius correlates with the Platonic idea of the forms as well. So Simplicius has really persuaded me that there's a good chance that Aristotle was more aligned than many people understand. So Gerson's book, I'm sure would be informed by that late Neoplatonic tradition, as well as all the extra scholarship he's done. I mean, he's been a professor of philosophy, and he has a book, like an analytical summary of a bunch of Aristotle's works. So he's done like the technical philosophical work. He really knows the historical tradition. He is a translator. He knows the languages. So Lloyd Gerson is someone I'd like to get deeper into. Okay, so Don Thompson donates $10. Thank you very much, Don. So it seems like I just have to enable donations first, and then I can see the chats. I still don't know how to find that $3 chat, but we've seen the mustache, so we're all good on that front. Don writes, Erval, there are no systems with an ontology of race. I don't know if that's entirely true, but okay. We need to be able to ground and justify the purpose and reason for existence of white people in a philosophical or religious system. This is a crucial first step. Thoughts? I have discussed my philosophy of race before. There's a video on my channel, a scientific theory of root races. So to explain all of that would be very time consuming. So I do refer you to that particular video. There's another video, pan-dimensional identity. I explain that from a perspective of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. There's the kernel of the idea of like genuine races or an ontology of races, philosophically speaking. I actually got from an unlikely source. Let's see, David Deutsch, who is a physicist. He's written a couple books, and I don't agree with his overall worldview. He is an atheist. He's also Jewish, but he invented the concept of quantum computation and is a subscriber to the many worlds interpretation. His books are well written, well argued in general. I just deviate on some crucial points that basically make the difference between going towards theism, going towards the immortality of the soul, and the more Platonic line, and then the direction that Deutsch takes it. But the kernel of the idea that is important to expand on is the notion that in the multiverse, if you draw like the phase space of all possible worlds and model that phase space, just like with the wave function, it's a probability distribution of all the possible positions, and there will be a peak of that probability distribution in one place or another, right? So certain configurations, material configurations, are more probable, and so they represent like a bigger object in the multiverse. Certain, even historical events. This is one theory I have of deja vu. Like when you have the sense that like this seems familiar, you're moving through a period that has a kind of inevitability to it. Like the events that are happening were going to happen in one form or another with slight variations. And then there are other events that are more ad hoc, random. They'll come and go, and they could be any number of different ways. But certain things, like, for example, the invention of the wheel. However, the particular invention happened in one universe, that kind of event is a crystalline structure in the phase space of the multiverse broadly. It's like it has a certain permanence, it has a certain reality, right? Now apply that to the idea of biological variation. So there are forms that will survive in many different worlds in the multiverse that are well represented, that they're the peak of their respective probability distribution. And deviations away from that peak, away from that archetypal form, are going to have a lesser degree of reality. And so among humans, and here's going a step beyond what I've said in the past about this, but among humans, there ought to be like one archetypal form of man, and particular races will be closer or further from it. But then, like with any interference pattern, because you're not going to just have one bell curve describing the phase space of all the various possible races. You're going to have a bunch of different peaks. So there are going to be stable structures, and then there's going to be a most stable, like most represented archetypal race of humanity, and then there will be stable races in like kind of discrete clusters. There will be some overlap. There will be mixed types between all, that aren't as well represented in the phase space, but they're there. And then there are ethical consequences that come from that too. So this is a big question, and it's an important question, but I also don't want to take up all the time. I appreciate the donation. So yeah, hopefully that was enough of the beginnings of that idea. I do plan on fleshing that out more in the future. But yeah, thank you, Don, for the chat. And I kind of derailed wherever we just were. So I apologize for that. Who was speaking just before I went on that?
I was speaking.
Okay, yeah. So you go ahead, and I'll.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. When I see a pattern, when I recognize that a dog is a dog, am I directly experiencing the form itself, or am I experiencing a reflection of the form, and the form itself is within the demiurge or God's mind?
Right. Well, it will be both in some sense, of course. Like, and I don't have a firm stance on this myself. The idea is like, when you perceive a quality in your experience, are you perceiving like true redness, or is it just the image? Well, I think it is an image in the sense that it's not that thing in its pureness, but I do think that the true universal is there present in the object itself. So there is an imparticipable, exempt aspect of these forms. There kind of has to be for them to act as archetypes, because if they're always enmeshed in their participants, then there's no like oneness or unity to them because the participants are manifold. So I'll do the Platonic answer to this and then my own thought on it. The Platonic answer is, yeah, there has to be an imparticipable form that we never touch, because if we touched it, it would involve itself in multiplicity. It wouldn't have that oneness then that is the explanation of how many things are similar. Things are similar because they participate of one common quality. But if that one common quality is inexorably involved in a multiplicity, then it seems to depart itself from oneness, and then it no longer explains the oneness in other things. So there has to be that imparticipable aspect, and then there were reflections off of it that we perceive. So that's the typical Platonic answer. My take involves I've described it several times on the channel, my core philosophical idea, which is that any finite structure always exists with respect to a superposition of the possible contexts for it. In reality, there isn't one fixed context that any given system exists in. If there were, then the system in question would have to be kind of infinite. Leibniz had the idea, the analyticity of predication. So when you predicate a relation of one thing, like John is related to Ralph, then that's describing a property that John has. It's not just a relation extrinsic to John, it's part of what John is, that he lives where he lives. Like all of those relational properties belong to John. They're analytical properties. Analytical properties are like within the thing itself, as opposed to supposedly synthetic properties that are, the combination of that true thing with other things. For Leibniz, like all properties are analytical because each of us is a monad, and so we embody in our identity all of our possible relations. So taking that idea, any finite system, if it existed with respect to the entirety of reality in one fixed way, it would be sort of infinite in informational content. And I don't think that's the nature of the physical world that we live in. Like, things aren't fully specified, and that's not the way it looks with quantum mechanics. So there are a couple arguments to back that up. But anyway, that's my core insight. In light of that, the simpler the system, the more possible context it exists within. But the system itself, irrespective of which particular context it's in, is a reality. That's like the form, okay? The form is the simple property or quality that's there, and it exists with respect to a cloud of its possible energies, its possible instantiations, in its pure form. When we see it from the outside, we contextualize it. So redness, for example, redness exists in itself with respect to a cloud of its possible instantiations, the pure form. And then when we perceive a red thing, that is one slice of the probability distribution that is redness itself. You can then take that and say that, well, the identity of the pure form already involves the probability distribution around it. And there's Neoplatonic justifications you could use for that, in that the identity of the essence of a thing is described by its effects. What is Plato's criteria or criterion for a thing being real? Does anyone in the chat know? How does Plato define what is real and what's not real? It's causal power. So if you have an effect on other things, you have reality. So a thing is insofar as it affects other things. And so the form is insofar as it leads to the being of its participants. So it is still independent relative to the dependent participants, but its being in some sense is dependent on the participants existing. So that question of, is it inexorably involved in the multiplicity? Well, I would say no, because with respect to the form itself, the cloud is one with it. It describes its own nature, but when viewed from without, from the perspective of our particular essence, so we also have a kind of form where we could exist with respect to many possible contexts, and in ourselves, it's not determined. And then when we bump into another form, another person, or another universal, that leads to an interference pattern of particular instantiation where we narrow down one element of redness, not redness itself in all of its possible instantiations, but one particular description. So I think the redness that we perceive is, we are making contact with the true redness, but also there is a state of the redness in itself. So that's to give my full thing. I'm also like not trying to monopolize the space too much. I just have this problem where I can't help but ramble on and on about these philosophical topics. So I apologize for that. I'll throw it back to Growing Mustache one last time, and then we'll move on to somebody else.
Yeah, I think I partly understand it. It's like if we look at a pillar and we see one side, but the pillar itself in like its full shape and its full temporal shape is like a little bit of another thing. Like when we see one side of the pillar, that implies that there is another side of a pillar, but the pillar itself is like, we're just touching it. We're literally looking at one side.
Yeah.
That is kind of what I took away from this.
When you perceive the pillar, you're perceiving that aspect of the pillar which is codependent with you. Because the identity of the pillar also involves being in the world where you're there looking at it. Like that aspect of the pillar involves you, just like you involve it, and your perception of it defines you. So it's a mutual entailing. So you're seeing that part of the pillar which you're codependent with, but of course, yeah, there's many aspects of the pillar that you're not touching.
Yeah. Okay. It's a little clearer now. Others can go. I'll hassle later.
Okay. So there are several hands raised. We've heard from Soma, and I've spoken with Jolly Crocodile several times. Let's see who Rob is. This is a new person, or we've met before.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
I don't think we've met before, but I wanted to talk about the Skepticism post you made on the 27th. Is that like too off topic, or can we talk about that?
No, that's fine. Sure.
Okay, so I was a bit confused about whether you took reaching this final state of absolute certainty, of intuitive knowledge, to be, or the possibility of reaching such a state to be a refutation of skepticism. Because I think if so, it kind of misses the point of what radical skepticism entails, which is more that from that inner state of absolute certainty, you can't like do a meta check, right, to discover whether or not this certainty is actually correlated with the truth of the thing that you're certain of, or if it's just a psychological state which could be caused by any number of things, by sort of brute mechanism.
I thought of that objection. Do you have more to add, or?
Well, I just wanted to see if your aim in that post was, was just to, because I totally agree that this state can be reached, that it's possible, that it's real. But I wanted to check if your point in that post was just to make that point, that this is a real possible state, or if you were to go a bit further, or attempting to go a bit further and say that this actually refutes skepticism.
Well, I think it is refuted depending on the type of skepticism you mean. I would say that state of certainty is not just psychologically possible. And I'm not making an assertion in that post of metaphysical possibility of the state of absolute certainty. I'm making a point of epistemic possibility of the state of absolute certainty, which is sufficient, I think, to refute a certain form of skepticism. So I'm not saying I know that such a state of certainty is genuinely possible. but I'm saying like I don't know that it's not. And if the skeptic wants to assert that regardless of the state of mind that someone gets into, it's always going to be possible for them to step outside and say, well, but is this certainty genuine or not? That assertion, I think, can be refuted through a self-contradiction, where you are you then certain? Do you have absolute certainty that there is no mental state which cannot be doubted? And if absolute certainty, then you see the self-contradiction. That state of mind is the state of mind that you're saying cannot exist. The very one that the skeptic is evincing by saying that I know that there is no state of mind that can escape any possible doubt. Well, by saying I know that, you're saying there is no possible doubt of the skepticism or of the skeptical stance.
So you wouldn't take this to be engaging with like a more traditional type of Pyrrhonian skepticism, which isn't necessarily saying that there is no state of mind which is immune to doubt, or the subject can, always criticize from an internal perspective. But Pyrrhonian skeptic would more say something a bit more universal, a bit less subject oriented, just that there is no, there's a sort of irreducible symmetry between any two beliefs in terms of epistemic status.
So the positive claim there of the skeptic, and that's not exactly what I understand Pyrrhonian skepticism to be. I would think Pyrrhonian skepticism is the idea that like there is positively absolutely no certainty in any case. And it's good to accept that and just live in the aporia, live in the, there's another term for it, a Greek term for that kind of like release, psychological like satisfaction you get in accepting the ambiguity.
Ataraxia.
Ataraxia, yeah, that's it. It was more like an ethical stance, but also involved like the outright denial of the possibility of certainty. And I think to deny the possibility of certainty is to make a certain claim, and that involves the self-contradiction. But can you explain more your summary of Pyrrhonian skepticism?
Yeah.
Or even better, like what brand of skepticism would you advocate for here? So,
as I understand it, Pyrrhonian skepticism, it does involve this ethical component that ataraxia is the good life, and that it's not only epistemically warranted by a process of basically internal investigation of one's own system of belief, but it's also happens to also be the correct way of living, the how to achieve good life. But the idea of there being a symmetry between all beliefs is one that how should I put this? It basically states that you can use the skeptical modes, like Agrippa's trilemma, to construct a absolutely symmetrical chain of argument and evidence for one claim, and then you can basically construct identical structures of argument and evidence which lead to two completely opposite claims for any claim that you would like. And this then is what leads us to. Okay, so I'm just wondering what your response to that would be, because
well, I mean, that also falls prey to the same self-contradiction, because if you're asserting that any two propositions can be arrived at, two contradictory propositions can be arrived at by symmetrical and equally well-justified chains of reasoning, okay, well then that claim that is the case, you could say that you could equally say that it's not the case, and that would be equally well-justified. So you therefore, like by your own claim, have no, stronger reason to believe that is the case, that, kind of ambivalence or equality of all possible truths, than the opposite. You see that it applies to itself, right?
Well, it certainly does apply to itself, but I wouldn't say that there's a explicit contradiction in believing something for which there's no justification, right? Like, I think every skeptic would admit that there's no justification for Pyrrhonian skepticism, or at least no justification which puts it above an alternative position. But I guess that won't stop them from believing it, well, at least in the initial stages, because the final result is meant to eliminate skepticism itself. And Sextus Empiricus talks about this, that the skeptical way of reasoning eliminates skepticism itself. How in the way that medicine eliminates the disease and then it purges itself from the body. So two things. I wouldn't say that there is actually an explicit contradiction in believing something despite recognizing that one has no justification for it. And secondly, I don't think, this skeptical hypothesis or this thesis doesn't necessarily, you don't need to hold to it your whole life, I guess is the point.
Okay. Well, I wasn't asserting that the contradiction is in believing it, because clearly you can believe something without good evidence. That doesn't involve a contradiction. But the proposition that any two contradictory propositions can be arrived at by symmetrical chains of reasoning equally well justified, that proposition itself runs into self-contradiction. You can still believe it, but because any is a universal claim. But by its own reasoning, there's an equally strong argument to the opposite effect, right? So
yeah, I just don't see the contradiction there. I mean,
what do you mean?
Well, if you were to write it out in first order logic, I don't think you could derive a contradiction. It would say for any proposition, there's an equally strong justification for one or the P or not P.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, P. Like the truth, there's no I guess the reason there's no contradiction is because you have to introduce a predicate for being justified, but you don't need to introduce a predicate for being true. These things can come apart in the space of logical possibility.
Okay, so you're saying that P and not P can always be equally well justified. That's the claim one.
Yep.
But then, so call that claim D. Then D and not D, and therefore, not D involves not all P, therefore not let me, I could try to write it out.
D and not D are not as part of the claim here. What's part of the claim is you have to introduce a new predicate. No,
D is a proposition itself.
Yes, it is, but you have to introduce a new predicate which says D and not D are both, you have to apply the status of both being equally justified. So it wouldn't say sort of D and then D and not D. It doesn't say that everything is true. It would say rather that you can justify the opposite belief just as well as you can justify this belief. Nevertheless, this belief is true. Now, that's an irrational way of reasoning, according to most systems of logic, but not because it's contradictory. It's just because it operates by just asserting something without justification.
Okay. Let's keep looking at this for a moment. It might seem a little bit pedantic, and I'm not up on symbolic logic. I looked at it years ago, but I haven't been studying that kind of logic. But anyway, so let's just organize this train of thought. So the claim, which we'll call claim D, is that all P is X, which is X being subjective being equally justified by two contradictory chains of reasoning. Or who's typing in there? Rob, are you typing?
I'm just taking note of what you're saying.
Okay, go ahead and mute while you type because the keyboard sound is pretty loud. That's all right. So yeah. D, the claim, is that all P is X. Okay. And D is a P, but then D itself, the opposite of D is that some P is not X. So to me, the contradiction is you're claiming by necessity simultaneously that all P is X and that some P is not X.
Okay, this is good because I think we can just narrow down on what the problem is here. The Pyrrhonian skeptic doesn't need to accept not D, because the Pyrrhonian skeptic doesn't need to accept that. They don't need to apply the rule, if one of my beliefs is equally well justified as another, then I should believe the other belief as well. So the Pyrrhonian skeptic might reject not D. Nevertheless, they would accept that not D and D are equally well justified.
Yeah, but they're both entailed by, because when you say that all propositions are subject to equally valid, then like the proposition that not all are equally justified, it's like it sort of just becomes meaningless, because you're saying all propositions can be equally justified or their opposite can be equally justified. That proposition then all like that some propositions cannot has an equal justification. So you're admitting as epistemically possible the opposite of what you're claiming as equally valid. And so I guess, yeah, you could arbitrarily say the one and not the other, like, but then what you're saying is that I'm not really arguing for anything. I'm not making an argument. I've just said, and but the original claim then still turns out to, like, it's not like asserting anything universally true. You're not making a universal truth claim. And so like that seems to be the contradiction to me, that like you're saying all X or P or all P or X, but then you're also saying, but I'm not making a universal truth claim, because I admit there are other contradictory things that are equally well justified, but I'm just not looking at those. So I don't know, maybe it doesn't involve a logical contradiction. Maybe, but it does seem like it's meaningless if it's not contradictory, because the statement is all, but you're also admitting that some not as a logical entailment.
No, yeah, so the skeptic wouldn't say some propositions are not X. They wouldn't say some propositions are not, sorry, what was what we said there? Not equally justifiable. But they also wouldn't say some.
But they're admitting, though, that chain of argument, they won't take it, but they're admitting that chain of argument, that some propositions are not equally well justified, is also equally well justified. They're admitting that it's equally well justified to what they hold, the opposite of what they're saying, but they're just arbitrarily going to pick the one that they're going with.
So, yes, but okay, so two things. First of all, yes, but that doesn't involve a contradiction, because the fact that two propositions are equally well justified doesn't entail the conjunction of those propositions, right? And the second thing is that the skeptic the reason they're going with one chain of argument instead of another is because this chain of argument which leads towards the skeptical conclusion is the one which is supported by common sense and common reasoning. So the idea is that we start from within our world of beliefs and convictions and dogmatic prejudices, and then we use its own resources to deconstruct it in a sort of immanent critique. So they would say that in giving this argument, although it might not be although it might not actually have any epistemic advantage over the argument to the opposite conclusion, it still affects the people who hear it in an asymmetrical way, right?
Okay.
Because they already agree with the premises which are being used in the argument.
Let's just dropping the idea that it involves contradiction. The skeptic then will say, despite there being no like logical reason to prefer the proposition of skepticism over the alternative, there are non-logical, common sense reasons outside of that. Well, the Platonist can say, despite there perhaps, and I don't accept that this is true, but despite there not being a discursive logical argument that establishes the possibility of absolute psychological certainty that is indubitable and guaranteed to be true, nevertheless, there are non-logical, noetic, or intuitive means of accessing truth that do demonstrate that. So if we're on a par on the logical arguments, well, then the skeptic can appeal to non-logical common sense, whatever that is, and cultural notions, whatever they may happen to be. And then the Platonist can appeal in the other direction up from discursive reasoning into intuitive access to truth and say, well, my intuition grounds that certainty. And so those two paths seem symmetrical to me. Like, why should I prefer popular opinion to like intuition if I can argue that, well, intuition is what grounds mathematical truth ultimately, because axioms can't be discursively proven. There has to be some intuition grounding like our notions of logical, what is logically entailed and what's not. And so I'm going to trust those intuitions because it's necessary to trust them in order to use logic. I'm implicitly trusting in those kind of infallible intuitions in order to engage in any chain of reasoning in the first place. And so I favor the intuitions that grant certainty over whatever people happen to say.
Yeah, okay, that seems reasonable. I guess my concern would be that if so are you familiar with Agrippa's trilemma, like how it works?
Agrippa's trilemma?
Yeah.
I may have encountered it. Why don't you go ahead and
it goes by other names. Basically, the idea is that so for any proposition, it can either be unjustified, i.e. just asserted, or justified. If it's just asserted, then you can equally well assert the opposite. Mm-hmm. If it's justified, this chain of justification can go back infinitely, or it can go back to a stopping point.
Yeah.
If it goes back infinitely, you can construct another infinite chain of justification to a different conclusion. If it goes back to a stopping point, then that original stopping point is itself an arbitrary assertion, and so the whole, system of the foundations are just built on nothing.
Well,
or it's circular. Right?
Yeah, the intuition addresses the accusation of arbitrary assertion, because like the axioms of Euclid's Elements aren't arbitrary; they're grounded in intuitions. Like if he tried to claim otherwise than the basic notions that he uses about the nature of a point, the nature of a line, then his system wouldn't work. No one would agree with it. Like math works because we all kind of agree on the nature of these axioms because they're not arbitrary assertions, although they do end at a certain point.
Yeah, so the skeptic wouldn't necessarily say that the axioms in mathematics are what are arbitrary. Instead, they would say that these axioms are grounded by the claim that they are very intuitive, right? And that seems absurd to doubt that because, well, it's immediate knowledge, right? Like it's just imminent to the subject. So how do you doubt that? But nevertheless, it is a proposition which itself, you can say the opposite, and you can say, or the skeptical interlocutor can say the opposite. They can say, no, it's actually not intuitive. It's actually totally unreasonable, not even for me, but for you, that these axioms are true. So there's still this equivalence is what it's called.
But that's not. But I would say that that's a much inferior argument to the opposite. So then we're like, so what's the more valid assertion? So first of all, the kind of ontological claim is that there's this kind of realm, a real. I don't know if I want to characterize it in ontological terms, but like divided line terms. There's like epistemic faculties that are higher, that ground discursive reason. So by the time you get to discursive reason, the starting point, it's not just nothing. It doesn't begin with that proposition. The nous is real. Intellectual intuition is real. And past a certain point, it blends into discursive reason. And the first proposition, I guess, is that these intellectual intuitions are real and they can ground and do ground the first premises in any logical chain of reasoning. So if the skeptic wants to deny that, then that's tantamount to denying the validity of those intuitions. And I think there are better reasons to support those intuitions than to reject them. So and we can just argue, well, that's where we are now in the argument. So we can argue on one side or the other. And I'd say, if you deny the existence of those intuitions, then you don't have anything to fall back on in any system of logic. So any formal system of logic that you refer to claim that your logical argument is valid or invalid, that stems from intuitions of their formal necessity. And if you deny the validity of those intuitions, then you undercut the ability of your own reasoning to function. Whereas if I posit the trustworthiness of those intuitions, then whatever chain of reasoning that I'm engaged in has a ground and can be supported. The other, like you can have auxiliary arguments to support the validity of those intuitions. One is like from the CTMU, syndiphonesis. So the idea is that if there are two distinct entities that we're talking about, they exist within a common syntax. Otherwise, we couldn't register them. We couldn't recognize them as distinct objects. So there has to be something in common between any two things that we are talking about, because they both have at least the property of being capable of being talked about. So reality and the foundations of reality we can talk about as in common, or the same world, the same reality, and so the same kind of syntactic field in linguistic terms as ourselves and our mental properties. So they can't be like totally radically different. The nature of underlying reality and like the laws that it functions according to, and then the nature of our mind and the laws that it functions according to. So by this principle of syndiphonesis, we can argue that there will be structural features of our minds that are grounded in structural features of reality. I mean, if you just accept that the mind is part of reality, well, then the structural nature, the structural principles of reality are there in the mind too, because the mind is part of reality, subject to the same laws, subject to the same universal kind of metaphysical constraints. And so mental intuitions are grounded in the structure of reality. And that's why we should expect some of these intuitions, like logical intuitions or intuitions, even like ethical intuitions of beauty or goodness. We should expect them to correlate to features of the world, not just for evolutionary reasons. Even an evolutionary argument is the same kind of argument, just describing a subset of the natural laws. Because again, describe like the phase space of all possible lines of evolution, and there's going to be commonalities across all possible worlds that are not dictated by, happenstance evolutionary circumstances, but are baked in to the framework in which evolution was possible in the first place. So given that, certain intuitions ought to be grounded in metaphysically necessary, non-contingent, structural features of reality, and that grounds the certainty of our intuitions. So that's an auxiliary argument that these intuitions are trustworthy. So 1 and 2, what does the skeptic have that's ambivalent and equally valid to deny the existence of those intuitions?
Okay, so just on that second point there, that seems to me to be circular, because it's about justifying like the axioms of reasoning, right? But it's obviously a chain of reasoning. It operates within a logical system. Even if it's not written out formally, it still relies on our basic intuitions for what seems correct and what not, like the law of non-contradiction, law of identity, even a bit of like Bayesian probability based on like what is the most probable theory based on the data. That's one thing. And then the other point 1 about the skeptic not having anything to fall back on to justify their claims. I think the idea of skepticism, because the skeptic ideally is supposed to be this like ascended person in ataraxia, they aren't necessarily it's more like when they're giving a skeptical argument, it's more like they're giving the chain of reasoning to someone who does have these who is within a system of belief, and then they're going to implicitly accept, or sorry, I'm not being very clear here. The skeptical modes are presented as things which the philosopher or the scientist or whatever can basically apply to themselves. Right? So the skeptic doesn't even need to be an active participant in the conversation. They can just present the idea, and then the philosopher can go away and think about their own system of beliefs, and they presumably will accept that two propositions which are contradictory but have equal amount of evidence for them, one shouldn't accept one over the other. right? And the skeptic as a person doesn't even need to be a part of this, right?
Yeah,
They can
but
just present
again,
the
you keep on kind of smuggling in that idea. Like, I just flatly reject that any proposition and its converse are equally well justified. I like, case in point, the existence of these intuitions and the non-existence. I think the existence of these intuitions is way better justified. So I don't
Right,
accept that
but
premise.
do you not think that argument is circular that you gave, because it relies on principles of reasoning, which are
Do you think
themselves
Euclid's propositions are circular because they rely on axioms?
No, I think the argument that our intuition is about which axioms are correct, that you gave is circular, right? That isn't a part of Euclid's elements. But it's part, for all intents and purposes, Euclid may as well have just stated them, right? Or as far as I know, he did, right? He didn't provide this
Syndiphionesis.
This
Yeah.
word is famously difficult.
Syndiphionesis.
Yeah, he didn't provide an argument for why the intuitions should be held to be reliable, right? So I wouldn't say that Euclid's elements are circular. I'd say it's foundational. I'd say it bottoms out on axioms. But would you not think that because the argument which you gave for the reliability of our intuitions relies on principles of reasoning, which themselves are supported intuitively, would be circular, right?
Yeah, well, it's saying if A is the case, then, so if the intuitions are valid, is the implicit assumption allowing the chain of reasoning in the first place. We're trusting in them, but I would say we're not trusting that in them in the same way that we're trying to come to that as a dianoetic conclusion. We're trusting in them not according to discursive reasoning, where the hypothesis is that we're trusting in these intuitions due to the interaction of intellectual intuition and discursive reason. So that's the supposition. And so we're baking that, just like a scientist may assume that they live in a world with cosmic evolution, with biological evolution, with the epistemic faculties that they recognize in their theories. Like, the epistemic grounds of anything will involve the theoretical notions internal to its own worldview. So yeah, the argument is circular in the same sense that absolutely every worldview will be circular, because the epistemic norms are within that worldview, not somehow outside of or prior to it. So the epistemic norm or idea is that discursive reasoning is grounded in intuition. And so granting that as the premise that we're working from, now we'll draw out the consequences and why we might expect that to be the case using that reasoning that now we are trusting. And then we'll see if discursive reason does circle back on the original proposition, but they're two distinct kind of epistemic states. One, we're trusting the intuitions non-discursively, and the other, we've run through the discursive process of justification rationally, and now we have a proposition justified by discursive arguments to that effect. And yeah, there is a similarity, but one is assumed noetically, the other is assumed dianoetically. So I don't think it's circular. I think it's as circular as any worldview, but not especially circular.
So what about an argument which would say, I'm sorry if I'm keeping you too long, by the way, we can move on in 5 minutes or so, but what about an argument which would say the propositions which seem least intuitive are the ones which we're going to accept, and we can say that this is our starting premise, and then we can apply the same process that you just spoke about, where we think, okay, what would be expected under this premise? What would seem to be, building out from this? Would it loop back, and would it be expected under this system, right? So the idea that whatever is the least intuitive is true, or more likely to be true.
If you could make this work, congratulations, but I don't think you're going to make it work.
Okay, just let me see if I can.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is going to lead us to a bunch of really bizarre beliefs which nobody accepts. And one of these, and we're going to say, okay, the more bizarre your belief, the more likely it is. And then someone comes along with this belief okay, well, look, this really bizarre idea, which is actually what we started with, which is that the least intuitive proposition is probably the correct one. Now, that is an idea which is highly unintuitive to most people, and I would say probably no one would have a sort of intellectual seeming that that is the case. So under this system, the people working under this premise would actually say, "Oh yeah, that's well justified, given our starting conclusion, given our starting premise." The idea that the least intuitive proposition is the true one is actually it justifies itself in the same way that the idea that the most intuitive proposition justifies itself, right?
Okay, well, the difference there is that the end state and the beginning state of the argument are actually at the same level. They're the same sort of proposition. So one is an arbitrary assertion. It's not, you're not claiming that it's grounded in anything. It's just it is an assertion which could be rejected. Whereas the intuition thing is not a mere assertion. It's grounded in something else that you have access to. So
it's grounded in the. Sorry to interrupt.
Then the conclusion is just that, well, my arbitrary assertion asserts itself, therefore it's true. And so there's been no transformation from the beginning of the argument to the end. You're at the same level of just flat assertion.
Let me just check if I've got your idea clear. Is that if we start with the idea that the intuitive propositions are the correct ones, then we can work out from that, and in that system of
No. That's not the claim.
Will,
the claim isn't that intuitive propositions are correct.
Or more probably.
No, because it's not the propositions. It's not that intuitive propositions are correct. It's that intuitions ground the certainty about propositions.
You mean like the psychological state of the certainty about propositions?
Well, we can start out with it psychologically as a brute fact that yes, descriptively, phenomenologically, they ground the psychological certainty. But then running through the discursive reasoning that epistemic intuitive certainty grants us, we can then develop into well-justified metaphysical claims of certainty.
Right. But then these well-justified metaphysical claims are ultimately justified by the intuitions, correct?
Yes, they're justified by the intuitions. But that's not a proposition. The intuitions are not a proposition. Where you went from a proposition to a proposition, I went from intuitions to a proposition.
Okay, but then but the idea that this relationship between the idea that this okay, so would you say that the beginning is more of a sort of, it's like pre-philosophical, right? It's just the intuitions just give you the propositions, but you don't start off going, okay, we're going to say that whatever we find to be most intuitive is correct. It's more like the intuitions just create these beliefs in our head, right?
They don't directly create the beliefs. They create the conditions under which belief formation takes place as a matter of fact, as a matter of brute fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then when you're reflecting back on that, I understand that it itself is to be expected under that belief, but like there's then a further question which the skeptic can ask, which is, okay, like, why is this criterion of truth that we are working within, like I think you called it the hypothetical deductive method, right? Like, why not have a different one? The skeptic would ask that, right?
Well, because hypotheses aren't just logical assertions. They're not just propositions. Hypotheses better be grounded in some empirical factors, some intuitive factors as well. Like a mere proposition doesn't make a good hypothesis. Like you have a hypothesis because it's compelling for other reasons, because perceptual, predictive, like there's some ground of why you're giving the hypothesis. It's not just some arbitrary assertion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that makes sense. I should probably just let someone else speak. I have further thoughts, but I think I've used enough of your time. But thank you.
Are
for
you
that
really
explanation.
sure?
Very
Are you
helpful.
sure that you have further thoughts? Because I can think of equally well justified lines of argument saying the contrary. All right. All right. Who would like to go next? Jonathan. He joined later, and Jolly has been in here for a while. All right, Jolly Crocodile.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can.
Hey, how you been doing? It's been a long time since we talked.
Yeah. Doing well. The community's going and everything. So
I did have a question about that, if non-philosophical ones were allowed, but I guess just generally, I'm reading this book called the Theological Origins of Modernity. I'm sure you've heard of it, but in the book, it goes over various ideas about how modernity comes from. It's like an influx of things, but the biggest. But the non-philosophical ones were allowed. Oh, I'm sorry.
Somebody mute. Let's see. I think Outmeister, if you could mute, please. Thank you.
Anyways, yeah. So it's sorry, it's derailed my train of thought. It's basically about how like nominalism overtook scholasticism in the Middle Ages, and this led to a sort of modern, as opposed to like it'd be like a modern thought process versus like thought processes from antiquity.
Sure.
Anyways, basically, just modernity is it's an easily traceable concept, which, as the book suggests, has a theological origin of like being self-originate, being based on progress. It's sort of a novel thing, I would say, that humans really haven't dealt with before. But it's mostly based around concepts like nominalism, which would be there are no universals. So I guess my question is like, what do you think the progression is from here, right? Because it doesn't seem like, well, like Aristotelianism, scholasticism, it failed in combating this concept and is basically lost. And, nominalism, modern thought processes have been popular mainstream for hundreds of years at this point. We could see it sort of accelerating with people literally denying reality at this point in various ways. So I guess like what do you think the trajectory is for the world?
Yeah.
Do you think there could even be a different school to rise up and challenge this, because it seems like it's unbeatable?
I don't know about that. I think Aristotelianism wasn't defeated. Scholasticism, which was under the dogmatic authority of the Catholic Church, was defeated. So the problem is not with Aristotelian reasoning. I mean, and before that, obviously, like if they had just been Platonists, this never would have happened. It's like a distortion of Platonism through an Aristotelian lens, and then a distortion of Aristotelianism through a dogmatic Catholic lens that was defeated. So, like, if you just fought the original opponent, the actual like Platonic realists who were Platonists originally, then nominalism would have had no chance. It's only by like gradually having these images of the original true Platonic philosophy through Aristotle and then Christian scholasticism that it became susceptible of defeat. But the core reason why it was defeated was that dogmatic attitude. As you know, in that book, he traces the origins of nominalism to the belief in the omnipotent will of God. So the question is like, what is, and we kind of play with this when we ask questions about divine omnipotence. Can God make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? And so that seems to limit the possible omnipotence of God. And the only rational like response to that is that, well, it's not a genuine possibility. God is not constrained by something outside of himself. He is the laws of reason. And so self-contradiction is simply not brought into being because it's not genuinely possible. He is the ground of that possibility. He is reason, right? And that is the Aristotelian position, that the first mover is thought thinking itself, which pre-contains all those forms of possible reality in a unitive fashion. And that's just like the one pre-containing all things in Platonism. And that actually works. But when you disconnect God's being reason from God's being a will, you separate the reason and willing in God, well, then you have nominalism, because God's omnipotence can just overthrow the principles of reason. He can eliminate the possibility of triangles existing. He can create self-contradictions, because logic be damned, because he's omnipotent and he doesn't bow to logic. But that assumes that there's a non-identity between logic and God. But if there is if God is logos as well as a will, well, then you have to come to this kind of divine simplicity idea, and problems of omnipotence don't necessarily arise. And I think we see the trace of. So let me expand the thought a little bit more. Like institutionally, it was because people believed in the unbridled dogmatic authority of the church, and I don't think that was as present. The church became more dogmatic in the medieval period because it became institutionally dominant, right? It was impossible to question the church because the church legitimated kings. In the Roman Empire, when the church was one group among many, there wasn't this unified central dogmatic authority. There were Platonic bishops who believed in the pre-existence of the soul and the eternity of the world. Synesius of Cilicia, I think, was one. So there was far more respect for philosophical dialogue in the early church. Then as the institutional authority increased because of real world factors, then people believed more strongly at an ideological level in the preeminence of dogma. And that dogmatic attitude was then applied to the creator. And God then, with his omnipotent will, could have any truth subsist, rather than his being tied up with the nature of truth. He is truth. So that's the disconnect. And I think it's because of institutional factors. And I think today, dogma is eroding. And also, I do think we are seeing the erasure of the kind of secular dogmas that have taken the place of religious dogma. And you can see it in the reasoning of woke people. We just take for granted things like human equality, or that anyone should be able to express any sexual orientation they want. These kind of unquestioned dogmas that have no good justification. They are in a dogmatic mode of thought still, but those dogmas are being eroded. They're becoming less popular, especially the ones around racism. That's being openly questioned. So I think with the internet, we're going to have a democratization in a positive sense, not a negative sense, like a meritocratic democratic process of the exchange of ideas that cannot be stopped. And there's not going to be a central authority that can force these dogmatic truths on everyone to accept. We had media monopolies from the 60s through the early 2000s, and then the internet democratized again. And so we're going to go back to a more open democratic process of idea formation. And so in that context, we're going to go back to Platonism, because that's what wins in open debate. And it's what has won in open debate, just like, the perennial philosophy in Hinduism has persisted for thousands of years, same basic notions, because it's true. So I do think the truth wins out in the absence of coercive political authorities like the Catholic Church in the medieval period, or like the kind of bureaucratic dogmas of the post-war consensus. And that will erode.
Well, a lot of this stuff, and I haven't got through the full book, but a lot of this stuff with the philosophical decline was obviously taking place at the same time technology really started to kick off. So he was saying that there was when these big disagreements would happen, oftentimes there would be these breakthroughs in science or something that would bolster the common opinion towards materialist thought versus religious thought. So I don't know. I guess you might have been saying that it just might play out in reverse as there's a sort of decline in the technological society wherein starts to. Obviously, I think we're seeing it fall apart a little bit. It might just be that process in reverse that leads to the destruction of this worldview that we're under now.
Yeah, I mean, it is dependent on power, basically, and how effective central, like, dogmatic authorities can be. If central dogmatic authorities can't be powerful, then nominalism will fail. I think nominalism can only subsist where a belief in the irrational, willful assertion of some central dogma is taken for granted. So as we move away from dogmatism, which we have been, we'll move away from nominalism too.
Do you think the Catholic Church has reformed itself? Do you think if it gains more popularity, it'll stay more ecumenical like it is now?
I mean, I don't believe that much in the benevolence of the church. I think if they gain more power, they will be more coercive and authoritarian. So I think it's sort of a show of weakness. Like they have been declining in power. Maybe they've grown in numbers somewhat, but like who are the Catholics? A bunch of third world people. So like they're becoming less relevant in a certain sense, although more numerically dominant, but not compared to Protestantism. So I think some of the way the church has acted in the 20th century just reflects them acknowledging the weakness of their position, and they're just caving to the authority of the new kind of dogmatic powers in this world. But,
I had so just one more.
Sure.
Will you allow non-philosophical questions on here? It was just about return to the land.
Let's not, so that we can just keep it consistent with the theme.
Okay. All right. That's all I had. So thank you very much for your time.
Sure. Thank you, Charlie. Good to talk to you again.
Likewise.
Okay, Soma already spoke. He still has his hand raised, but you didn't speak that much, and the others got like more of a chance, and you were here first. So, Soma, let's hear from you again, and then we'll move
on. Yeah. So, would I be able to share my screen? Or
to do what? What are you going to do with your screen?
Just so I can point out something a bit easier, like my notes. Like diagram, but it doesn't matter really.
No, you can. What's the concept? Okay. What do you want to share?
Like just like the difference in like the participatoriness, I guess, of the universe now compared to, let's say, the Sanskrit era, right? Because back then it felt a lot more passive, right? Like ritualistic. You were within a scene, right? And since, let's say, Christ, it feels more and more like you're actively engaging in the process yourself, right? Like maybe during the Sanskrit era, right, there's like a very small minority that kind of the vanguard that leads away and creates the rituals, and everyone kind of engages in them. But now it seems like it's kind of up to us to do that stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Joseph Campbell, that's how he characterizes like modern mythology, if you can call it that. We went from more authoritarian modes. We went from like pre-philosophical myths to philosophically involved myths, which were the axial age philosophies / religions. And then we moved to a kind of like dogmatic phase of European religion that was more propositional. And then now, as that breaks down, because the cosmology of the Christian myth has broken down, that's Campbell's take. So we're like reconfiguring our mythological context under no central authority, kind of parallel to the way that the original pre-philosophical mythologies originated. They just sprung up as dreams, folk tales, and like whatever went out. And so in the modern day, we have these content creators, movie makers like that. Those are the people composing our myths today. So yeah, we're more involved in that sense, I suppose. What's the idea?
Yeah, so the idea, I guess, is that we kind of have to merge the two in the next phase, right? Because you can be ritualistic and eternal and cyclical and indiscriminate and all that kind of stuff, right? But then you are kind of lost in the flow, right? And then something, and then in the participatory version, you're constantly heading somewhere, but there's no, that the context is constantly fluctuating. There's nothing to stand on really. So, and then I guess where we're going, you're going to have to need both the context to be cyclical, and you're going to have to, within it, to be like participating in each deviation from that central thing and each return to it. Kind of. I don't,
So
yeah.
a synthesis of, I guess, so Hinduism, you know, they talk about how like even our own will is kind of illusory as a separate thing from Vishnu or Brahman, like that is the author of all action, and so everything's kind of just happening. It's one great interconnected happening. Like you have to be involved and play your part, but it's not like your decision. It's like individual agency and the ability to create your own realities is not as conspicuous. And then we have a more creative phase, but then that separates us from artha, or the metaphysical structure and principle of reality. And so then the synthesis is like we creatively depart, but then also revert cyclically. So it's a dual phase engine of mythology where we create, but then always bring it back. And that, you know, it could be something like what Plato did with mythology and Platonism did with mythology, where there's the poet and then there's the philosopher to interpret. And actually that's what we do anyway, organically, with like modern literature. There's the output and then the analytical synthesis, and it's like here's the creative efflux, and then here's how it fits under rules that we understand of composition. So it's like we're going through that cycle, but what you want is for the reversion phase to go beyond mere convention and to be grounded. We have to believe, basically it's the nominalism question again. We have to believe in the objectivity of symbolic reality, rather than the idea that like culture forms are culturally contextual and just like sui generis. There is a genus beyond individual culture forms and myths. There is the reality itself that we can converge upon. And so that has to be more conspicuous. So I guess we have to transcend literary criticism, which is the first iteration of the reversion phase of creative mythology, and have a kind of philosophical analysis of myth, which will inherently be cross-cultural, a comparative mythological mode of thinking. And I think that just takes place through institutions that are non-dogmatic, because dogma is kind of an extension of the ability to filter what myths people see and what myths they don't see. So if we see it all, then we can synthesize not back to the relative culture grounds of the mythological forms and symbols, but back to the ultimate grounds of reality. And we just need institutions that engage in comparative mythological study, comparative history, and like looking at all of that in a way that's not just multiculturalism, but is kind of an imperial project where we're building one correct, ontologically grounded, myth of the 21st century, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess the structure that we would create, it would have to last long enough that we could do those things you're describing, like the departure and the consolidation and the return would have to happen like orders of magnitude much faster than they're happening now. So we kind of just we're doing it now. We've been doing it for thousands of years, let's say, and even hundreds of years and stuff, right? But we would be doing it in months, and like just the speed would increase, right? So we'd enter different scales.
I think you're seeing that. We're seeing our like getting our bearings in that mode, like self-reflective irony meme culture
Oh yeah,
we're
definitely.
using
Definitely.
symbols that we recognize that we're creating that are kind of arbitrary, that are kind of silly. We're like seeing the flippancy in them, but at the same time, like understanding the world through them. But I'm saying we're getting our bearings because clearly, like, there's a more serious mode that's possible. Well, I guess if like we've descended from Greece was kind of the high point of our civilization, according to like a extended Spenglerian model. So if you say Western civilization as a whole involves classical antiquity down through modernity, then like Greece is the original culture phase of this whole arc. Well, then in the procession, they went from an emphasis on the tragic to an emphasis on the comic, and now we're going to have we've seen a renaissance of the comic, and now like funny movies aren't made, and like stand-up comedians suck, and it's just like memes are old, and we're going to return to the tragic and see the seriousness. We can still be self-reflective because it's a reversion back to, and I guess it'll terminate in I don't know, the new Homer or something. But
Yeah, that does make sense. It's like, yeah, memes are dead. People like tragedy seems to be the next chapter, maybe.
so good news.
Good news, good news.
Tragedy is
Sure.
better.
Well, it might be more useful.
Maybe. Well, the medicine has to reflect the sickness, and the sickness of our time is tragic. So maybe like it's time to stop laughing at it and absorb the seriousness, but in a self-reflective, not a reactive way.
Yeah. Also, you said that Vishnu incarnates. We have maybe some degree of free will, but we're caught in the narratives of let's say more sophisticated forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of agree with that, and that kind of makes me feel like wherever plays out, it's not like I want to act in it, I want to engage in it, and I want to participate in it, but me not doing so wouldn't negate anything. Like it's just going to play out how it is, right? There's no
Well, that's like fatalism, and I think it's sort of
not
similar.
strictly though, not strictly, because I do feel I can participate in it and I can have an effect on it. I just feel that the point of it isn't to change the outcome, it's to be engaged in the revelations that are revealed in the process.
Yeah,
And the outcome will be suitable for what is right for us, maybe.
yeah, but I also think so. Just to go into my own philosophy, like I don't think the future is inevitably going to converge towards the good. I do think like if your soul converges towards the good, then your world will converge to the good. And then because we're not in one shared world, again, each finite system exists with respect to a superposition of all the possible contexts. So you don't live in one world. You live, in my philosophy, in a superposition of all the possible worlds you might be in. And so as you like the direction you take is the direction your world takes. So it is like all up to you. I don't think in a, I guess, higher sense, the outcome is fixed and that all the possible worlds are realities, whether you witness them or not. But like where your soul goes is entirely determined by your soul.
Okay, well, how does the so you have a superposition of multiple realities. How does that affect the experiential relation between each of those distinct realities?
Can you clarify the question?
Yeah, so like I do something in this reality, right? And let's say maybe are you trying to say the superposition that I did it because of some unknown and unseen interaction with those other positions in those other realities?
Okay, yeah, the other possibilities do influence the choice that you make, but the individual choice is also a factor. So the idea is basically that like all the logical possibilities have to have ontological subsistence, and like clearly counterfactual truths can be logically assessed, and so they need an ontological ground to support. That's David Lewis's line, right? Counterfactual realism. So we need an ontology to support the truth value of counterfactuals, and there are many of them. So we want logical completeness, and we want our worldview and our metaphysics and ontology to reflect all of the logical possibilities. But what's missing, if we don't have our individual input on what we do, is the why the collapse of the wave function goes one way rather than another. Because there's no reason in the physics that tells us, there's no logical mathematical reason why this rather than that final position for the particle. So our will has to intervene there, and our will is the principle of sufficient reason behind the particular world line that we end up going down. But it is, as you say correctly, it is influenced by all of the other possibilities, because they kind of collectively, I think we're quantum computing the world of possible futures, and that, so the decision, the willful decision, is like guided, but the ultimate kind of snap, when it turns over towards a collapse or an actuality, that's like our will is that.
I saw a video of yours the other day, and you were talking about how, like, the Christian, let's say the Catholic or whatever view is, you can kind of maybe generalize it to, it's a one world system where you have a creation element that is focused entirely on this one project, this one frame of existence, let's say, and that kind of puts like an immense pressure on you, maybe, right? Or something. And then, but on the other end, you have, let's say, the Sanskrit view, which is that it's a flat circle, everything's just happening endlessly, it just goes on forever, right? And like, if you're kind of stuck in the middle between those two, it's kind of hard to negotiate a middle space where you can maybe take the most useful stuff out of both of those.
Yes, we want middle paths. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next person, but I like the thoughts. Thank you so much. Also, Don Thompson donates $5, just showing my support. I appreciate that, Don. Don is carrying all the weight here. Again, like, I think not to be just like money hungry, but we have to move to a position where we are collectively supporting one another. I am building the community. I'm trying to provide a space for philosophy. And if that means something to you, if that's valuable to you, you probably should give it some value. You know, like, give it some of the value that you have to give. Because if you're just passively consuming, that's bad karma. Like, if you're being given something, you should give in return. And I do want to be incentivized to spend my time doing this, because again, like I said at the beginning of the stream, like, philosophical discourse has totally collapsed in the right wing. Keith abandoned philosophy. Joel abandoned philosophy a while ago. Like, Fuentes has gone in a much more pragmatic, like, active direction, which is his nature. But he used to have more like theoretical content as well. It's not like he never touches on theory, but he's become less theoretical, more historico political. And I just see the same general tendency. It's like people are going into religious communities which deny the possibility of, hashing out fundamental metaphysical disputes through reason. Like, we've given up on that appeal to reason, and yet we are engaged in the discourse. And what happens then? Well, then the discourse becomes all rhetorical effect. Who has the most followers? We're giving up on truth. If you want to be grounded in truth, I do think you need that philosophy. Like, Catholicism worked because it was grounded in true philosophy. And like, everyone knows, they stole that stuff from the Platonists and Aristotelians. Like, hardly any original philosophy came from the Christian worldview itself. Most of the true stuff in it, most of the solutions to philosophical problems come from Platonism or Aristotelianism or Neoplatonism. So if you think that reason and philosophy is of value, and all the church fathers acknowledge the value of it, and obviously I'm trying to start the school, if you think it is of value, you should, try to make sure that we create spaces, and that's what I'm trying to do. So please, put in a super chat, ask a question, or give your comment, or just show your support. I appreciate that, Don Thompson. We have to, I was talking to Lucas Gage, and he was saying, like, Jews support one another with the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. Like, young Jews get all these resources from their fellows. Jews donate to Jewish causes. They organize. They love other Jews, and like we tend, like, I just assuming most of you guys are white. If you're not, that's fine. You can participate in philosophical discussion with me anytime. But for the white folks out there, like, if we don't have a similar fondness and like appreciation and support for one another, especially when someone is active, then we're gonna lose because we're inactive and we're bickering. And at least if we're gonna bicker, let's do it in a philosophically organized way. Because I'm just gonna throw in my own random argument here. Like, if disagreements have to terminate in disagreements of value, right? Fundamentally, like, what is good to do and what is bad to do is dependent on our definition of what is good and bad. Okay. And if we can't have ethical discussions to determine what is good and bad, then we can never communicate about what we ought to do fundamentally. We can only do it provisionally on the basis that, oh, we all agree that this or that particular policy or particular outcome would be good or bad. But we're just never going to have that integrated cooperative framework that allows us to compete and save ourselves unless we are able to discuss ethical differences. We need spaces to do that, and no one is providing a space. So, okay, so Jonian, shout out to Airval, Subscribestar, wealth of unlisted content in there. Yeah, I've privated, unlisted a lot of videos over the years. If you guys support on Patreon or Subscribestar, you can have access to that. And I unlist things for a variety of reasons. Some of the content I think is good, is like true stuff. But in the past, YouTube was more censorious than they have been lately. So some stuff was, I self-censored. Some stuff I just thought wasn't my best work. So it is kind of a mixed bag. But yeah, you could keep yourself busy if you are looking for more of my thought. But let's get back to the discussion. Thank you again, Junian. Greatly appreciated. Let's get back to the discussion, because the point of this is to have an environment for philosophical discourse, and I'm going to keep doing this as long as you guys keep showing up. I also just enjoy the conversation, so thanks for everyone who's participating. And let's go. Let's see. There are a few people. I don't know what the order was. Jonathan, good to see you in here. Let's just say hi to Jonathan. How's it going, Jonathan?
How's it going? Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to drop in to make sure that the question I put in the YouTube chat gets addressed. So it's kind of a subject that I kind of think on again, off again. I've been doing for quite some time now. Is that I guess like a surprising thing, sort of, about Platonism when you dive into it is how much they favor the limit as opposed to the unlimited. Because I think most people, like, colloquially associate a lack of, well, not lack, but I guess like not having limits or infinity with a sort of transcendence of contingency, and therefore a sort of greatness that's that makes it better than limit. Whereas the Platonists seem to associate, I guess, the unlimited with a sort of privation, where I guess because it lacks limit, it therefore lacks unity, and therefore any I guess like ontological essence. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are concerning the question. Okay, so is this because like colloquial understandings of infinity and the Platonist understandings of infinity are at root different concepts surrounding infinity, or if they're just like different perspectives on the same concept?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, for the Jitsi call, I don't intend it to be all like you guys interact just with me. You're also free to jump in on one another's questions. I haven't really figured out how to do that well yet, but I do want to invite the crosstalk. And I'm sure in future episodes we'll do that more. But yeah, so limit, the principle of limit, what does it limit? That which is as yet unlimited. And so limit is active upon the limited. And what is that which is limited? Well, it is what is prior to the application of limit unlimited. Matter is an absence of form, right? Like matter can't be any particular form because matter is like the substrate on which some form applies itself. So matter in itself is unlimited. Matter is inferior to form because form acts upon matter to alter and affect the matter. The matter doesn't act upon the form in the same way. So this is the same basic dichotomy as the masculine, which acts upon the feminine to give form to the feminine. Like obviously ancient concepts of biologically what's happening with reproduction are not totally accurate, but they conceived that like the seed contained the formal principle of the offspring, and that's carried in the male and then imposed into the feminine matrix that absorbs it and cultivates it. So it's for those reasons, but also like there are two senses of infinity, right? There's a higher no thing, the being that is prior to limitation, and then there's the unbounded that is an absence of limitation. The higher no thing contains seminally in itself both the principles of limitation and unlimitation, because that is beyond all possible definition. It's not yet the unlimited, it's not yet the limited, it is not either of those. And the designation infinite is sort of symbolic in that case. And you could equally call that the one, right? But Platonists over like Hegelians, or rather than Hegelians, or rather than many modern people talking about theology, like even Christians will sometimes talk about God as the infinite, or God, like the preeminent quality of God is his infinitude. But why should we call the first principle, which is necessarily prior to any duality, prior to the limit strictly speaking and the unlimited strictly speaking, why should we call it one? Because in general, like these are all super intelligible realities too. Like the principle of limitation is prior to any form because it's the principle of form. So it isn't a form that we can know. What we know are essences, forms that we can, contemplate with our intellect. What does the intellect act upon? Essences, intelligible essences. The principle of limit is not an intelligible essence, and so our intellect can't fathom it. So how do we know the characteristics of the infinite or the finite? Because they're beyond the forms. We know them by their reflection in the world of forms and their reflection ultimately in material reality. And in material reality, we notice this column of differences, just like the Pythagoreans identified, the right hand versus the left, the masculine versus the feminine, the limited rather than the unlimited, form rather than matter. One aspect of this column is superior and acts upon the inferior. Agent, patient, all of this stuff stems from the primary duality that is pre-formal, that we can't intellectually apprehend, but we recognize the images of that primal duality in things in the world, and we notice the asymmetry there, and we take the valence of these two first principles from their reflections in the world. And so that's why when we then go to name the oneness that must kind of logically precede that primal duality, then we're going to name it after the column that instantiates in a superior manner in the world. So form is superior to matter in the world. Limit is superior to that which is unlimited in the world. Like formless, stuff we don't view as beautiful. Whereas like an intricate design that is imminently structured and principled and limited by like law, that we view as beautiful. Like the gray goo is unlimited. It just expands endlessly with no particular constraints, and that's ugly. So it's from its images in the world, primarily, that I think the Pythagoreans, and that is the origin of this, not the Platonists, but the Pythagoreans, that they identified that asymmetry in the way they did.
Okay. Well, I guess like a particular thought I had about this subject is that I wonder if like certain attributions that most people give to infinity are actually attributes that Platonists would actually give to limit, or the principle from which limit derives.
Well, yeah, like Hegelians, when they talk about the infinite, they're talking about like no thing. They're talking
Yeah.
about like that's the Sanskrit or Indian idea of like apophatic predication, neti, neti. The Brahman is not this, not that.
Yeah.
It's no one particular thing. So yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Jonathan. I'm glad to talk to you again. It's been a little while.
Yeah.
Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing rather well. Thanks.
Awesome. And also, by the way, like I'm not turning my camera on in the Jitsi because my camera displays anyway on the screen, or at least I think it does. But you guys are definitely welcome to have your cameras on, just to say that. So let's see who all is in here. Outmeister, I think, was here before Vovid. I could be wrong.
I was, but I dropped out for a little moment, some connection issues.
Oh, okay, well,
But
then
yeah.
you lost your place in line.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, very well. This is only tangentially related to philosophy, but it's kind of, I've been thinking a lot about the lines of, it would seem in some of the accounts of Pythagoras and Plato that they were interested in elite production, like they were interested in the formation of aristocracy to be ruled by the best. And this seems really pertinent because a topic on the right is that there needs to be something in response to institutional collapse, right? So there's like a need for new institution, there's a need for new leaders with some level of urgency. And I've been thinking a lot about things related to that topic and where there's like efforts going towards that direction. And I know that you were interested in kind of starting like a Platonist academy. And I'm kind of curious, like from your vantage point, with the aforementioned like topic, do you have some sort of aims or aspirations in that direction of somebody that could fill that role?
You mean to fill that role myself, or can I identify someone who could fill it?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be yourself, but creating maybe a nucleus of people that can do that role. Because I would imagine with a Platonist academy, at some point, the aspiration would be to have somebody who could kind of fill that role of, maybe back then it was called a philosopher king, something of that role, because I do kind of see the ultimate ambition of Plato as being intertwined with the ruling of society in a certain respect.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he identifies the authentic statesman with the philosopher for a variety of reasons in the Statesman, the dialogue, and elsewhere. But I guess foremost is that the governing of the state involves the proper coordination of all the subsidiary arts. So, what branch of learning allows you to perceive the goods of all the subsidiary arts? Well, once again, ethics is a branch of philosophy, so de facto it belongs to philosophy to determine like what is architecture good for? What kind of architecture is good? The architect can build you the building, but he doesn't necessarily know what that is good for, because that goes outside of architecture per se. Now, you could have an architect philosopher who also has philosophical ideas of how his product should kind of integrate with the wider society. But in itself, like if we have to identify one branch of learning that allows you to weave together the various roles in society, well, only philosophy is capable of even the definition of the other roles within society. Only philosophy can identify all the other functions. No other science can do that. So it has to be philosophy. And also, the philosopher has the psychological characteristics that you need in the ruler. Ideally, the philosopher should have self-knowledge, and he should have the elements of his soul balanced. I mean, you're training your rational faculties. You are strengthening your thumos so that your reason regulates your own life. I don't think anyone is really close. I think like we in general are failing morally, like all of us, and that's why we're in this situation. So I don't think like it'd be nice if we had the philosopher king to just come down and show us all the way. I think the best we can get, and Plato talks about this also explicitly in the Statesman, is a good balance of personality types in an institution that weaves together the necessary functions. And so we need communities, intentional communities, because they're like the mainstream society is just so unhealthy. Just think about what people eat, what people listen to, the music they listen to is unhealthy, the TV they watch is unhealthy and unwholesome. It's just pervasive, and people have nihilistic thoughts. It's like we have to just create intentional communities where we can at least hope of getting it right. But then we're all damaged from our participation in this general society that has corrupted us. And if anyone thinks they're immune, I'm going to call your bullshit and say, like, you're just as bad as the rest of us. Like, this is I think we're all kind of at some level on a moral par. And some of us are, you know, further along the philosophical path, but also the people with greater abilities are letting us down more because they could be doing more. Even the people who are doing the most, like, well, no one has actually successfully created a way out for us. No one has like saved our people. And so the people who are most capable bear the most responsibility in that failure. The people who are inept by nature, like even if they just showed up for their job and didn't do anything remarkable, in a way they could be just as good or just as bad as the person with exceptional abilities who is not living up to their potential, just because of the difference between their potential and their actuality. Even if in absolute terms, like one person is more accomplished than another. So I think there's a kind of moral parity of all of us here sharing this timeline. I think that's why we're in the same world together, because we have that common desert. We all deserve to be in this world, and that's a moral thing. So that being said, like, it's not that one perfect philosopher king should just show us the way. We don't deserve that yet. Instead, we need communities where different types who have different complementary virtues can engage in dialogue. So once again, like, we need to believe in reason so that we can work this out and find the functioning of a society that can then produce men of a higher type. We don't have that man of a higher type. It would take a community to raise a philosopher king. So first we just have to build the communities, and then have respect for reason, so that like maybe we don't have the ideal philosophers, but the best philosophers can have the most influence. And to do that, we also need to kind of defeat dogmatism. That's my opinion of how to build that. So we need communities of discourse and physical communities where we can raise people in a way that kind of goes back and forth between like too much conservatism, too much liberalism. I'm speaking like in psychological types, not in terms of policies. Too much like closed-mindedness, too much open-mindedness, like the all the personality characteristics to bounce back and forth to see the virtues in all the paths, so that then that becomes conspicuous, that's played out, that's on display, so that then the young, like, potential philosopher king can see the totality of the human condition and see all of the kind of theoretical options before him, and then he'll be raised in the right way with all the data, and then, like, it will get to a point where the philosopher king is just obviously the guy, but none of us are that guy, so we have to raise him.
Yeah, that's very well said. I am very interested in the environment, so to speak, for raising them, like the creation of the ideal environment, raising the philosopher king to be. I'm just out of curiosity, are you familiar with the figure of the 20th century called Gurdjieff, G.I. Gurdjieff?
Yeah, I've run into him. I've never been terribly interested. I don't think he's a very original thinker. It just seems like another kind of spiritualist. But
Because he's very interesting to me in the sense that anything tangentially related to him is extremely boring to me. Like anything people have written about him, I get the same impression. But having read his own material, I am very interested in some of what he writes about. So my understanding, he is predominantly concerned about the production of sages. He wants to create sages. And he says that a sage is somebody who can do what? It is kind of what you could say, it combines the saint, those who are able to hold that type of like magnetic alignment, but also somebody who is truly learned and possesses knowledge of being, penetrating deeply. And I think Plato would say something to the effect that the sage possesses what the philosopher seeks. It's kind of like an ancient thing. We don't hear much about sages today, but
yeah,
he details a couple of really interesting things, because there's a prototype he saw historically that he thinks is possible to replicate. And he gives a sort of historical narrative of maybe the last 10,000 years on Earth, at least according to a sort of like esoteric tradition of what would be handed down about important historical events. One of them pertains to Atlantis, another one pertains to Central Asia about 3,200 years ago. And he would say, or he would imply, there was some tangential relationship between what went down in Central Asia and Pythagoras. It's something I'm kind of parsing when I'm kind of interested in the history of Pythagoras and his activities. Like, why would they form these communities? What were they pursuing?
The Scythian question. Yeah, I have a video on the Hyperboreans, and I look into Pythagoras towards the end of that video.
Okay, I will make a note of that. I have seen you have a couple of material on that. And the thing he has about Atlantis is he's not particularly interested in the society as a whole, but he is very interested in that there was a rising of a brotherhood that became extremely learned, extremely influential. And he would go on to detail that after the sinking of Atlantis, that brotherhood would have a very formative role in Egypt, have a very formative role in the coast of India, in ancient China, and what would now be the Gobi Desert, as well, I think, in places related to Turkestan.
Can I just ask, how is he grounding these claims? Like Steiner just basically says, I'm like remote viewing this stuff, but like, how does Gurdjieff claim to know this?
He details it in a lot of various ways. So some things is passed down by, he would probably say that some of it is what he has learned, passed down by brotherhoods that have kept this to themselves. Some he details personal investigations. In a certain case, I do remember he used that method of like, Akashic record is not the best word for it. He calls, but he says there's something that when you reach a certain level of development, the mental formations you make in your mind is able to actually materialize in the atmosphere in a lasting way that is somewhat analogous to how memory structures can be formed within the human organism. and he said he had to make recourse to that for 2 occasions. But it's extremely eclectic, and it's his methodology is like part of his teaching, because he's very big on like verifying things and trying to like elucidate all 7 aspects of something. He talks a lot about fundamental laws. I remember one of them being there. Every whole phenomena contains 7 aspects, and that's something you can use to kind of elucidate different details about something. But anyways, I don't need to digress.
Yeah. I will probably continue to ground my speculative anthropology, ancient history in like genetics and archaeology. But it is interesting. I mean, if I just followed Gurdjieff and others' tack and just like claimed to remember past lives on Atlantis, Jason Rezador-Johnny did that for a while. I don't know if he's still doing it. Then I could make much more interesting content. But I just feel this need to like stay closer to the data than all that. But yeah, interesting. I don't know if I'll read Gurdjieff. There's more there, but it is very similar to others in that time period, and all the spiritualists then, like, there's an element of kind of just the arbitrary. So going back to like how to train the philosopher king, I think Plato is again the place to look. And it's also just common sense, like classical education, like we need to be training people in math and rhetoric and logic and physical conditioning and combat sports and have games and contests. It's like, it's all common sense stuff. Like, how do you raise some, like, well, you teach them what we all were supposed to learn in elementary school and middle school. Like, it's not anything radically new. It's just doing it well, and also incorporating kind of a more holistic approach where, the physical and the mental are joined, and also it's kind of philosophically directed, as in like the curriculum is created by a philosophical class with an eye to the good of that education, whereas education kind of took a life of its own in mainstream society, and I think it needs to come from a philosophical class with an eye to the virtues of it. But yeah, I think Plato basically gives the best particular model in the Republic of how to train the philosopher king. So that's my first recourse. But yeah, interesting stuff. I'm going to go to Super Chats. Seneca, is there a conflict between detachment and governance? Well, I don't think so, because the Chinese have the idea of governing through Wu Wei. The emperor governs primarily by governing himself. The head of the social organism, his state will be reflected in the state of the polity as well. There's necessarily that kind of sympathy between the two. So that's the Chinese concept. That's also, I guess, part of the idea, like the Evolian idea of what an aristocracy is and what it's supposed to do. So the liberal arts, and this is a classical notion generally, the liberal arts are meant to allow a leisure class, so that's a certain form of detachment, a leisure class to know themselves and like reflect on human nature and cultivate the faculties of the soul rather than the body or any particular manual art. So that kind of detachment from affairs of the world, it has been tied to actual ruling classes. Historical societies have identified that a more detached ruling elite actually governs better, because I think ultimately of that Platonic idea that the ruler has to know the proper good of all the various branches of science and the different arts and crafts in society. And to identify each particular good, they can't be like zoomed in on one element of it. Instead, they reflect back on themselves, separate from the world, and then they can kind of dispassionately observe what is good for what in society as a whole. If you're invested in particular aspects of life, then how can you take that global view that allows you to weave the whole together? So, and there's also, of course, the idea of active or like engaged detachment. So you detach in terms of your like emotional investment. You detach from the anxiety and concern and care about like, am I going to do a good job or not? You get rid of that anxiety, that egoistic concern, am I going to do well? You have a faith in a process taking place that is larger than yourself, that you're a part in. So you detach from that ego involvement, but then also just go with the flow of the greater society from the top. So no, I don't think there's any intrinsic conflict between detachment and governance. Thank you very much, Seneca. I appreciate the super chats. Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely keep doing this. It's, again, like I said, it's just got to be worth the time. It is intrinsically worth it to me, but I'm trying to build this community. I'm not taking payment for being the president or gathering the people together. I don't want a cut of that because I want it to be as easy as possible for more people to get involved in the physical community. But it is time consuming. So it's like, if I'm gonna not just go back to work and kind of stop fulfilling that role well, then I'll have to find some other way, and hopefully this can be part of it. And we can also provide a place for philosophical discussion. We can start building the academy, which also, by the way, like, I am open to students as of now. I'm willing to get portable buildings. I have internet, I have electricity, so we're like building the capacity to house people. It'll grow from there, but if anyone wants to come down to the community specifically to like be part of the inauguration of the academy that we're trying to build, this is really the time to get involved, to reach out. You can message me on Telegram at Airvol, just like it's spelled on YouTube, AARVOLL. And then Junyan for $3. I think you should enable your camera in the call, as it shows up on stream and should lower the limit for participants to use their cameras, plus the benefit of immediate nonverbal communication. Well, it will show up on stream, but as far as I know, I am also in the lower left-hand corner. I think that's still the case. I think that's how it displays. So the problem would be I would be there redundantly. There'd be 2 copies of me on stream. So I think I'll have to. Am I wrong about that? I don't know if anyone is checking on it.
Yeah, actually, if I may, only one program can use the camera at a time. So if you just disable it somehow, I don't know what you're using to stream, but should be able to just only use the Jitsi camera.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I will.
Yeah.
I will look at that possibility. That would be better, because then I would be kind of on a par with the rest of you guys. It'd be a better dynamic. But if anyone has like, suggestions for the stream, also, I'll be reading comments after the thing is posted as a video. Also, if anyone got particular value out of one segment, one topic, and wants to clip, you're welcome to do that. If you want to send me clips that you thought were valuable, that would be a big help. If you can't super chat, but you want to contribute, you want to, again, like, if you're here watching this, you are getting some kind of value out of it, because otherwise, why are you here? If you're getting nothing out of it, then you need to think about how you're using your time better. But like, if you are here and you are getting value, then you should, again, try to give back. We will, again, I think you get the world you deserve by your own moral conduct. So if you are remaining passive, then your world will be dominated by extrinsic forces. Whereas if you get active, even if it's just, kind of responding. So there's 2 kinds of being passive. There's like being femininely passive, and then there is being like passive in the manner that like a soldier in an army is passive. Like, yeah, they're like obeying a higher thing that's going on, but really everyone should be passive to a higher order in that masculine sense. The feminine sense of like being matter that receives the form but doesn't give back, like that's not good. So if you're not gonna put out your own content or do something to help, I'm kind of also presuming that we're all kind of on one side of a general political struggle, which is also an interesting kind of philosophical idea that notwithstanding these ideological differences that I think we should hash out philosophically, there still ends up being kind of a tipping point roughly in the middle. And so we're all kind of loosely aligned in some form that we can recognize. And it's like the attempt to firmly define it ends up kind of partitioning it in different ways. But anyway, that's kind of a topic for a future discussion, perhaps. I don't know if I said Matthew Liberta says thanks for the stream, donates $10. Thank you very much, Matthew. Don Thompson, thanks, enjoyed this stream, $5. Thank you, Don. So yeah, we want to make this a regular thing, and hopefully it helps get the school started as well. I think that's something that will also produce good content. I mean, in the modern day, realistically, content is king, and we have to be putting out good content to perpetuate the messages that we believe in. That's just the world that we live in. And in a way, it's like sort of always been the world in the way it works. Like Julius Caesar was an influential historical figure because he made good content in the form of speeches. Like, why did his soldiers follow him? Well, A, he was a great general. B, he gave good speeches. So he was competent and he made good content. So you need knowledge, and you need that content factor to rise up. Maybe there are some leaders historically that just like found themselves in positions of authority, but the way to kind of rise up involves that logos, involves that not just speaking ability, but the message, and having a good message that people can resonate with. So yeah, if you want to influence the message that we are articulating in these streams, consider joining in the future. I'm gonna bring the stream to a close in the next couple minutes, but I don't want to ignore Vovad, because you've been in here for a long time. You've been waiting. F. Papias, it depends on how long it goes with Vovad. We may have to hear from you next time. But yeah, also let me know what time would be a good time for these streams in the comments after the fact, if you're still listening. But anyway, moving on. So Vovad.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just had I want to make a remark about the discussion you had about logic and stuff, about intuitions. If you remember, there was a guy arguing about intuitions. And my remark is basically that I think there was like a massive confusion. You know that there are like three common laws of logic that we use kind of intuitively. It's like the law of equivalence. Then there's like the law of non-contradiction and the law of what was that? Excluded middle or something in English. Yeah. So basically, I think the guy was confusing the law of excluded middle with the law of non-contradiction, because there's like those alternative kind of logic systems or whatever, and they exist for a reason. Which is that the third law, which is the law of the excluded middle, like no one argues about the first two laws, like P is equivalent to P, and that like what was that? Not P, not P, and not P. So basically, a statement cannot be true and false at the same time. So that's the law of non-contradiction. Now, the law of the excluded middle is that a statement must be either true or false, right? So why would anyone try to make like a logical system where the third law is not necessary, where it's kind of like ignored or whatever? Well, that's because we have, like, even in everyday speech, like even in English, we can construct a sentence, like a statement, that is not cannot be either true or false. So it's kind of neither. For example, like obviously, like you maybe have heard of that statement. Like everyone has at some point doing logic. Like the statement is false, right?
Mhm.
So it cannot. It's like an undecidable statement. So it kind of goes against the law of the excluded middle, kind of. So yeah, that's like, I think that's like partly the reason, as I understand it. And yeah, but basically, I just wanted like to mention that this particular thing is very interesting. Like I'm a freshman student, but I find it like very, very interesting because those undecidable statements, they kind of relate to Gödel's incompleteness. Like, have you heard of like the logician, like the mathematician Kurt Gödel?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, his incompleteness theory.
Yeah.
So what Gödel did is he basically kind of like there can be like the statement that like this statement cannot be proved true in this language, right?
Mhm.
So just imagine if we formalize this mathematically, right? If this suffices our like set theory axioms or whatever. So if there's like a rigorous, consistent, like deductively consistent way to form such a statement, and if we prove this statement, like that this statement cannot be proved true, then it's a contradiction. And what Gödel did basically is that he proved another statement, which is that there are statements that cannot be proved true or false. So it's like, it's very, very interesting, at least to me. Like so I just wanted to like
I don't-
because there's this
Yeah.
there's this thing, maybe you've heard of it, the Lucas Penrose, I think it's the correct spelling, argument about consciousness and stuff, and it kind of abuses this incompleteness of Gödel, like if you've heard of that.
Well, that sounds interesting. Let's address the first part, though. I'm not sure how related Russell's paradox is to Gödel incompleteness, because the idea with Gödel incompleteness is that we can know a proposition to be true without being able to prove it to be true within the formal constraints of that system. That's more related, and Gödel himself was a Platonist who identified this. That's more related to the intuitive basis of dianoetic truth. So we can have access intuitively to certainty, like infallible certainty, that a given proposition is true, and yet no constrained formal system will be able to prove all of its own internal propositions with its own axioms. Some will always have to be proved and can be known, although not, not formally proved, with that higher intuition prior to the system. That I think that's how Gödel took his own theorem as a Platonist. But Russell's paradox to me just looks like a logic loop that the referent, because it's circular, involves like it doesn't terminate. It's like a program that doesn't terminate on one value or another. It just it flips back and forth. So I think that's what's happening with Russell's paradox. And so basically you could say then that it doesn't have a fixed meaning because it doesn't ground or terminate in something.
Yeah, that is the Russell's paradox. So I believe that was like set theory thing where he kind of formalized this like Liar's in like set theory or something. So with the set of all sets and stuff like that. But the like my interest here is more of like Gödel's incompleteness, because basically what it basically tells us is that mathematicians sometimes know like a conjecture to be true. Like they almost like know it, like they know the conjecture to be true, but they cannot prove it mathematically, like rigorously. And this kind of gives, I guess, a bit of insight into how humans are a bit like different from, like there's something beyond kind of computation. Not just computation, but like this ability to foresee truth, kind of, if you know what I'm saying. So that is interesting to me. So yeah, I just wanted to spell that out.
Yeah, I think Gödel incompleteness points towards the kind of Platonic, intuitive slash dianoetic model of intellect. Yeah, like there is like the part beyond process. Another way of looking at it is that maybe it comes down to basically like quantum computing and classical computing. The classic computing is stepwise, like a Turing machine, and then the quantum computing looks at all the possibilities at once and like narrows down to a solution more based on like the topology of the phase space, you might say. So it's sort of like pseudo geometric, which is why like geometrical truth was privileged over arithmetical truth by the Greeks, because they saw in geometrical truth more of the intuitive ground and the necessity of it, whereas the arithmetical truth privileged or prioritized the stepwise methods or something like that. But yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, another thing I want to say quickly is that like this kind of intuition, like this ability of humans to say that to be certain that certain conjectures are true, kind of links in to mathematics, because like what a mathematician's job is really, it is not computation, is it? Like a mathematician primarily, like sometimes a good mathematician knows what axioms to use and stuff like that, like, and he just has like intuitions of what premises to pick. Like for example, like I remember maybe in this call someone mentioned like Euclid's postulates or something, where he had like the fifth one. So you can basically change the fifth one, which is about
parallel lines.
Yeah. You can change it so that you can get a spherical and the hyper. I don't know the word in English, but yeah, you can basically change the fifth axiom, and you can get different kinds of geometries. So like sometimes I think a mathematician, like a good mathematician, knows when to use what. You know, he just has, he already has like an idea of what he needs to do, and he's not like a computer that kind of achieves true like deductively, like kind of but he already has those intuitions, and he kind of uses those conjectures, like has conjectures, and uses his kind of deductive reasoning. So you could say that deductive reasoning itself is like more of a compass, like it's something that kind of leads your way. It's something that shows you the path or something.
Yeah, or the intuition prior to the deductive process is the compass, and then the deductive process is like the way you actually, tack your course or something. Yeah, no. Proclus, by the way, when he talks about Euclid's elements in his commentary on Book 1 of the Elements, says that Euclid was not giving like the only possible axioms of geometry. They were selected pedagogically, but also he says Euclid was a Platonist. I think he's the only ancient authority that validates that, but according to Proclus, Euclid was a Platonist, and the Platonists would generally, want to prioritize the superior type of something, even if other types were possible. So like when it comes to geometry, flat Euclidean geometry in flat space is superior to the curved space of hyperbolic geometry. So I don't know if Euclid recognized the nature of non-Euclidean geometry implicit in changing. Is it the fourth or fifth axiom?
I think it's the fifth one. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah, you're probably right. Anyway, I don't know if you recognize the full implications, but as a Platonist and as a Pythagorean by extension, you of course would want to prioritize the straight, the flat over the curved, because that is one of the members in the table of opposites. The straight is superior to the curved.
I think that the conventional history pretty much agrees that Euclid, Euclid's Elements was basically an attempt by Euclid to kind of gather up all of mathematics. So he was kind of the first person to even propose like having axioms, and then building up
Well,
from those axioms. So it was
Proclus,
basically like a book with like a lot of theorems, isn't it?
Proclus describes other elements of elements of geometry that had been written. So he wasn't the very first, and I'm not sure that he was the first even to have axioms like that explicitly spelled out, but he did a better job. If you want to read like Proclus's account, he goes through all the and most of the history of elements, mathematical texts that we have is from Proclus. So it's not otherwise attested. But it is a worthwhile read for a number of reasons. Proclus's commentary on Book 1 of Euclid's Elements. For historical reasons, also like you get some metaphysical interpretation of a point, of a straight line, of a circle. It's kind of neat, Pythagorean lore.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the thoughts there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your response. Yeah,
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely good stuff. So Tomer sends $25. Thank you, Tomer. Good stream. We'll try to participate next time. Yeah, I wanted to hear from Tomer. Tomer's been in the reading groups for years and has always had interesting things to say about, especially Plato's dialogues. But unfortunately, his mic didn't work today. So, but all right, we will go ahead and wrap it up now. Let's get a preview. Maybe F. Papias, you can join us in the future. What did you have in mind to say today?
Oh, I was just gonna ask about necessitarianism and the like debate around that.
Okay, well, I don't know what the term means, necessitarianism, so we can discuss that maybe in the future. But what is
can
it?
I just say I would totally like pay for like a Discord or like a group chat to talk about philosophy, and like I don't really care about like a reading group, like just a little, Discord would probably, I don't know, I'd pay for that.
Well, I mean, you can join the open forum discussions. I think general philosophical chat might as well be in public. It was kind of intended always to be not all philosophical discussion. Obviously, some is supposed to be esoteric within the walls. But yeah, I don't see any harm in discussing this kind of stuff in an open forum. We're in a very open age. So given that media is so open, like if only the bad is pushing its influence, only like rhetoric first, only influencer, kind of toxic memes, only like all the stuff we see online, then the space in general becomes polluted. So like, given that it's there for us, let's go ahead and put some philosophy out there. And it's not for everyone, and not everyone will follow. But I do kind of believe in the purpose of the stream in having a public philosophical discussion and hosting one.
Yeah, but you only host these like every 4 months. So.
Well, fair. Yeah. I've been moving. I've been like working on the community, and I'm now finally in a position. I just got fiber optic at the land, so I'm finally in a position where I can do this more often. I mean, I could even do this 3 times a week, maybe more, just depending on the time and all of that. But yeah,
should definitely do that 3 times a week.
3 times. All right, maybe like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We'll see about it. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks everybody who joined. Really enjoyed the discussion. I would say like maybe the highlight was the stuff about skepticism. Not that the other chats were bad. They were probably more aligned. I just like the contentious back and forth. And he admirably defended skepticism, even if it, maybe fell down at the end. But yeah, definitely. We'll also try to improve the dynamics so that there's more crosstalk between participants, and we'll, establish an etiquette maybe. But any suggestions, drop it in the comments. Thanks everybody who super chatted, who supported the stream. Many thanks, truly. I do want to be able to do this, and that helps. So thanks everybody. Take care.
Oral, could I just ask a quick question before we jump off?
You know
it's
what?
not a philosophical question.
about-
just
How about
practical.
after? I'll stay in the Jitsi after I end the stream. I'm going to end the stream. Thanks,
Perfectly
everybody.
well.
And then you can ask
All
your
right.
question. If I can figure out how to stop the stream. Oh, here it is. All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.